Test. Test 1-200. Test test. Test 1-200. Test yapıyoruz. Test yapıyoruz. Test 1. Test 1-200. 1. Test. Ses. Test 1-2-3 4 5 6. Test 1. Test. Test 1-2-3. Ses. Test 1-2. Test 1. Yaxşıdır. It's good. Test.
Today we're discussing the sustainability guidelines for large-scale hydrogen projects. And, it was my task to look at it from a private sector perspective. So how does an investor look at, additional criteria for projects? I think the answer is relatively straightforward. Time and again, we've seen that companies and investors that adhere to, sound criteria regarding how to integrate the local community, how to not violate environmental aspects, etc., they just do better. So it makes business sense to adhere to proper standards. You don't want to pollute the environment, but also if you don't, then you actually do better as a business. So in that sense, I don't think there is any conflict. Of course, we have to find a balance. There has to be an economic business case. Sustainability also means that there has to be a profit. Otherwise, the investment just won't happen. But I do not. Hello, my name is Frank Wouters, and I'm happy to be with you today. Today we're discussing the sustainability guidelines for large.
Hello, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the very last session of the day, probably. So I'm Smita Fakir, Industrial Development Officer at UNIDO, and I'm joined today by an excellent panel, and also we'll have a couple of presenters. So first of all, let me welcome you all to this UNFCCC side event titled Realizing Just Energy Transition Through Ambitious and Sustainable Hydrogen Projects. So that's a special one because we've been working on this topic. I don't know how many of you were in Dubai last year. We had a similar session, and we realized that there was a lot of demand for a topic, for such a topic. So we gathered together a group of UN sister agencies and beyond to work on some guidelines for what can create a sustainable hydrogen project. Also, the reason we went into it was because we were being asked by countries, countries that are almost that have the potential to produce renewable hydrogen, and we were getting questions from them along the lines of, we have so many potential investors looking to invest, how do we choose between one or the other? And we realized there was a need to create some kind of criteria, guidelines for countries, potentially financiers as well, and project developers too, to see what kind of what countries are looking for. So, as we know, hydrogen is a key a key energy carrier for the decarbonizing of the hard to abate sectors. It's a potential for economic growth in developing countries that have a potential to produce the that renewable hydrogen, and as a result, there are many intentions of to create projects, to develop projects that are propping up. So together with the partners of UNCTAD, UNEP, UNECE, IRENA, African Development Bank, IDOS, the government of South Africa, we have got together and put our skills, technical expertise behind developing some form of guidelines. And we are looking forward to sharing those as part of it with you today, but because it's still under development. So, as I mentioned, around the globe, there's a large number of large-scale hydrogen projects that are reaching FID. As the hype around PTX is starting to translate into real-world industrial installations, particularly in countries of the global south, they offer favorable conditions for renewable hydrogen production. But at the same time, they lack a clear reference point where, when it comes to evaluating and approving the incoming project proposal for sizable industrial sites, which inherently entail considerations of sustainability. So, thanks to the aforementioned organizations who are our partners in drafting and reviewing an insightful set of sustainability guidelines covering 4 topics, the 4 Ps as we call them: people, planet, prosperity, and power. With this, I would like to invite UNIDO's policy expert, and Frank Wouters, who's our private sector partner in this, to provide you with an introduction of our work before we move to the panel session. Jan, over to you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jan Sievernich. I'm a hydrogen policy expert with UNIDO, and I'll be giving you a brief introduction to the work that Smita has alluded to. So, as many of you know, renewable hydrogen is a large opportunity for countries in the global south, developing countries which have good conditions for solar energy and wind energy production. And this potential, of course, is economic, but also in terms of decarbonization, important to reach the climate goals in already industrialized countries. So that makes it an opportunity to export in the renewable rich countries, but it's also an opportunity for net zero industrial development within these countries. So beyond just the export, there is also the chance to build a hydrogen value chain and reap benefits that go beyond export revenues. And that, of course, includes employment, skills upgrading, investment mobilization, and building an overall more resilient and developed economy. Now, the promise of renewable hydrogen, one that is produced with renewable energy in the electrolysis process, is of course well known for a while now, but we're starting to see also it catching on in actual development of projects, large-scale projects in the real world. Projections are growing. The Hydrogen Council, which you can see here on the left side, is projecting significant growth within the next couple of years in renewable hydrogen production. And there's an estimate that in Africa alone, 50 million tons of renewable hydrogen could be produced annually. Now, specifically for large-scale projects, there's a stark increase on a yearly basis, for example, 35% between the years 2022 and 2023. And gigascale projects, of which there have been more than 100 announced by now, nearly doubled in announcements within that time period. Now, knowing this, the potential of renewable hydrogen and the expansion of the project development raises the question, why do we need guidelines for sustainable hydrogen projects? And it is a case really of shaping that development of that new sector, that new value chain that can be done. As Smita alluded to, governments want guidance in that regard. They can choose project partners through various means, regulation, permitting, infrastructure access, and so on, but oftentimes they lack a conductive decision-making framework for that. That can be used to assess these project proposals. And it can also be useful for development banks when assessing proposals in terms of financing decisions. So the case is really to build a transparent and trustworthy framework that both the public and investors can relate to, that creates value for the local economy, and that creates a win-win situation between the developers, between the local domestic economies, but also the local communities that will be the neighbors of these large-scale projects. Now, what we propose is a guideline that has been developed collaboratively with the organizations that Smita mentioned. It's a broad coalition of stakeholders that came together, bringing together various expertises in different thematic areas which are covered in this document. And of course, that broad coalition also lends the legitimacy to the guidelines that we are proposing going forward, and we hope will be used widely. Now, it's already been alluded to, but let me spell it out one more time quite clearly what the aims and the purpose of this is. We want to provide a decision-making framework that can help guide the financial or political approval of proposals that are being put forward by developers. That is in support of governments or development banks. It's a flexible set of criteria that we've developed. It is meant to maximize local benefits while minimizing sustainability impacts along the lines of the SDGs. So by flexible, we mean that it is meant to be considered within the local context. It's not a rigid checklist or some type of certification. And it's meant to apply to large-scale projects along the hydrogen value chain, not just production. Now, Smita mentioned the 4 Ps. These are the thematic areas and sections within the document. Within the people section, there's labor and social standards. For planet, we have a chapter on water use and environmental protection, respectively. Local value creation, sustainable financing within the prosperity part. And lastly, for power, it's about the provision of renewable energy to communities outside the industrial project itself. Now, without going into too much detail, let me briefly give some examples for the types of criteria that we're putting forward. Within the labor standards, we are referring to ILO definitions of decent work. We're putting forward requirements for health and safety protocols, training provision to build local skills in the value chain, ideally have a share of local labor throughout the entire life of the project, not just construction, but also throughout all the entire hierarchy and phasing of the project. And of course, addressing also gender equality, pay gaps, equal opportunities, and so on. For social standards, there's consent principles are featured, the recommendations to build physical infrastructure, transparency, community participation for the neighboring communities of the projects, water use, which will be important in many countries that are rich in sun, of course, are oftentimes also quite scarce in water. So pay attention to local needs, do risk impact assessments, thresholds, and if desalination takes place, to ideally oversize that for local use of fresh water as well. And the brine management, which is related to that desalination. There should be attention paid to life cycle CO2 emissions, protection of biodiversity, resource depletion, the end of life of the technology that is used, specifically electrolyzers, and also protection of natural carbon sinks. In terms of the prosperity, there is various criteria. There are some recommendations for government itself as well, but in terms of criteria, local currency financing and local financing in general is favored. The risk, investment risk profile should provide for that. Then local participation along the entire value chain, domestic end use, and cooperation with local firms could help the local benefits of the project. And lastly, with the power aspect, is that the power is to be efficiently used, that there should be surplus renewable energy for local communities, and that the projects can serve as catalysts for regional decarbonization in the framework of these criteria. So that was a brief overview of the work we've been putting forward so far. And next you'll hear from Frank Wouters, who is a representative of DII Desert Energy.
Unfortunately, Frank wasn't able to travel to Baku this time, so he's been kind enough to prepare a presentation, a video for us.
Hello, my name is Frank Wouters, and I'm happy to be with you today. Today we're discussing the sustainability guidelines for large-scale hydrogen projects, and you know, it was my task to look at it from a private sector perspective. So, how does an investor look at you know, additional criteria for projects? I think the answer is relatively straightforward. Time and again, we've seen that companies and investors that adhere to you know, sound criteria regarding how to integrate the local community, how to not violate environmental aspects, etc., they just do better. So it makes business sense to adhere to proper standards. You know, you don't want to pollute the environment, but also if you don't, then you actually do better as a business. So in that sense, I don't think there is any conflict. Of course, we have to find a balance. There has to be an economic business case. Sustainability also means that there has to be a profit, otherwise the investment just won't happen. But I do not think there is any conflict between not polluting the environment and integrating communities and adhering by good standards with business. So in that sense, it's relatively straightforward. Now let us look at one example, and that is water. Very often, hydrogen projects are very competitive in arid areas. Land is available, there's not that many people, and usually, very often, the renewable energy resource is fantastic. However, the name arid already alludes to it. There is not, enough water for anything. And very often, projects then will need to take seawater, so you build a desalination plant at the coast and then pipe it to a project location. Now, if you then look at the business case of that, you find out very quickly that the cost of water desalination is not very high. I mean, it's a big investment, but the overall investment is much bigger. And the cost of the water desalination is maybe 1 to 2% of the overall cost of the hydrogen production. And that makes it actually, from a problem to a solution. Because then you can consider just oversizing that water desalination plant, oversizing, for example, doubling, the production volume of water doesn't double the investment. So for a little bit of extra money, you can actually, provide additional water to communities that live around the plant. So instead of a problem, you turn this into a solution. People can, develop agriculture. We have cattle, et cetera, et cetera. So that is a great example of, sustainability guidelines that actually add tremendous value to local communities. Now, how are we going to use those guidelines? There's three, ways why, they're useful. First of all, it provides a common framework for understanding of the issues. So everybody that reads the guidelines thinks about local value creation. How can we extend the local value in the countries and for the communities? About water, about the environment, et cetera, everything that we try to cover in the guidelines. But then, secondly, it provides a framework for decision making, both from a government perspective as well as from a lender's perspective. If a government, orchestrates a new market, for example, through auctions for land for these investments, then the guidelines can support that decision making. And the same for the lenders. We also know that very often these projects, they require concessional finance provided by development finance institutions. And again, the guidelines can, provide a frame of reference for decision making, for who gets the money, how much money, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's relatively straightforward. We have thought about all these issues, discussed them at length. I think the result is fantastic, and they can be very useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan, first of all, and Frank as well. So as I mentioned before, this is a collaboration between UNIDO, UNCTAD, UNEP, UNECE, South Africa, IRENA, African Development Bank, and IDOS, and DII as well. But unfortunately, so IRENA, African Development Bank, and IDOS couldn't send a panelist today, but nonetheless, we're joined by Clovis Ferre from UNCTAD, Asher Lessel from UNEP, Dario Liguti from UNECE, Rebecca Massamrumule from South Africa, and Alicia Eastman from who's board director of Intercontinental Energy, representing the private sector. So let us now jump into the panel discussion. We have some interesting questions for all of you. So I think before we go into individual questions, just I would like to ask from each and every one of you, why do you think, very briefly, do we need guidelines like that, and why? Or if not, why not? Maybe we start from Clovis and we come down.
Well, thank you very much, Nita. And thank you very much for organizing this. And good evening, colleagues and participants. I think that the idea of the guidelines is give some framework for us to work with, to begin. So I think it's very important to have that. Also, in terms of working together as UN, I see the guidelines as a form to give coherence to the work that we are doing. There's a new area for some of our organizations, others not, but it's good that we have that as a guideline for us to think on a common framework and give coherence. Also, it is a very good opportunity to also facilitate and foster partnerships, including as we are doing now. You know, it create these opportunities for the partnership within the system. And it's a very good link as well with the country teams, because the guidelines will be used also to be operational at the country level, and that goes to the country teams. Of course, there are challenges on how to go about it. We have to first, once it's completed, we have to disseminate, tell the world that exists, not only to the world, but internally as well. The UN system is quite big and takes time to also understand that initiative happened. Also build capacity of how to understand and to interpret and to implement the guideline. So yeah, I would stop here, but those I think are key elements.
Thank you.
No, thanks so much for the question, as well as the opportunity to speak today. About 18 years ago, I moved to South Africa from the US. I remember trying to do basic things like order food. I would struggle because I would use ketchup versus tomato sauce, or napkin versus serviette. So what I learned quickly was that if you don't use the terminology that's used in that country, you're not going to get things done. So I think for me, and this is going back to personal experience, it gives me a set of definitions that I can use to communicate information. And because it's written down, the definitions are clear, the framework is clear. And even if you change it and you get guideline 2.0 or guideline 3.0, we have a starting point from which we can, progress the conversation. But also, I think what also is really wonderful about the guidelines is it's comprehensive. I mean, we talk about the 4 Ps: power, prosperity, people, and protecting the environment. I think that framework in itself allows us to ensure aspirations around just transition, aspirations around hydrogen, renewable hydrogen, assisting the economy, especially for emerging and developing economies, to come to the fore. And it's allowing us to communicate coherently why we just can't do this because we're protecting the environment, but the aspects of prosperity are so important. And then last but not least, I think when it comes to government and industry, right, sometimes government frustrates industry. So it's like we put something on the table and say, if you do the following, then we're fine. But if you come to a realization while you're learning by doing that, you want something else on the table, what happens is you break the trust with private sector and you frustrate them, you move the goalposts. So I think this to me is a really good starting point for putting on the table what you expect from industry. And if you do change the goalposts, you can say, well, I had something I thought was comprehensive. However, I'm learning more. Please forgive me for adding something new.
So thank you and good evening to everybody. So what I think is the guidelines add value is pulling out the project is a complex thing. Pulling out a project in the hydrogen business, which doesn't exist, basically, it's a new economy. It's even harder. And doing it sustainably is three times harder. So having a checklist, I think I see the guidelines as a checklist for investors, for project sponsors, but for government and financiers as well. that did I take into consideration all the different aspects about making such a complex, I'm embarking on such a complex endeavor. Believe it or not, many times things are forgotten or are not properly assessed or not properly underscored. To produce an info memo is it's an endeavor itself. I mean, ask any project sponsor how much time and resources and money they put into producing an info memo, which is the starting base from which an investor will be looking at the project. Without an info memo, they will not even open the door to that. And so making that sort of steps in a framework, as Clovis said, but with a checklist that tells you, did I look at all the aspects, and social aspects and environmental aspects, and obviously economic and financial aspects, technology, regulatory, are all those risks and all those issues addressed correctly, highlighted correctly, because it's not about, there are risks everywhere. The point is not avoiding risk. The point is highlighting those risks and finding the right mitigants for those risks and being transparent about that. So I think that's where the guidelines add a value in creating a new environment, in creating what is called the hydrogen economy, which is actually necessary. If you look at those numbers are great. Those are their intentions, but it's only 4 to 5% of those projects are actually reaching FIDs, which is nowhere near where we should be. We should be much, much, much higher, if only to make fertilizers in a sustainable way. Fertilizers, we consume about 100 million tons of hydrogen per year to be used as a feedstock. And 99% of it comes from fossil fuels. Just making that sustainable will be a major industrial avenue, a major industrial opportunity, and a major environmental opportunity. Thank you.
First of all, and thanks for having me. Does this work?
Yes.
I feel like I'm just naturally loud. And thank you, Smita. I guess I'm coming from the private sector. As Smita said, I'm on the board of Intercontinental Energy, which is a company I co-founded almost 11 years ago. We are really one of the first groups that went about creating giga-scale projects for hydrogen. And we have a project in Oman. We have 2 projects in Australia. The one in Oman.
I think they're having problem hearing you.
You can't hear me? Oh, here. Okay, thank you. I'm usually too loud, so. So we have a project in Oman, 2 projects in Australia. The smallest project is 25 gigawatts of upstream wind and solar. And then that makes about 1.8 million tons per annum of green hydrogen. And then from that, you can make 10 million tons per annum of green ammonia. These are very, very large projects. In Australia, our first project there is 7,000 square kilometers. And the second project is 20,000 square kilometers. So that's European countries, basically. And in Oman, it's a bit smaller, but it will also be 25 gigawatts. And because we started so early, and we formed a partnership with the Omani government in 2017, before hydrogen was anywhere near the levels that people even recognized what it meant. We basically had to sort of do these things ourselves. We had to think about all of these things. And, yes, we are a company that wants to make money, but we are also trying to achieve an environmental objective, which is to stave off climate change. And it goes without saying that we would not like to harm the environment while trying to help the environment. That just doesn't seem like the proper thing to do. So, the first thing you do when you look at a site is to make sure that you're not having to clear it, or you're not having to interrupt people's livelihoods or harm the environment or the animal populations. You have to look at all of these things. So it would have been really helpful for us to have these guidelines, 8 years ago, but we actually helped to write them and to provide information about it. As we looked into it, we saw all of these opportunities for synergies. One of the great things about hydrogen is it's not extractive, right? The sun and the wind come back every year. You don't take it out of the ground and leave it for good. And you don't have these sort of pop-up mining type of communities that are very they have a lot of downsides to them. I'm sure everybody is very aware of mining projects in particular. They create their own economies where most of the people working there don't end up walking home with any money in their pocket at all. They've spent it at the one place that provides food or shelter, and it's not a good model. The busing in and busing out and flying in and flying out. So the large projects offer these opportunities to create more complex economies in places that have almost nothing. I mean, the best place to have hydrogen is a coastal desert, and that is not the best place to have a human. So typically, that's not where people are. But there's a lot of things that you can do. I think Frank spoke about it earlier. You can use the excess oxygen when you split the water. You can use that to quicken the process of creating topsoil, and you can actually have food security by growing underneath the PV, and you have shade through that, and you can actually have food security, which is great. Smita already talked about water. Water is obviously very easy for us to do. It's 1% of the cost of the production, so to just make a little bit more is really almost nothing. And that can help communities to grow. It's the baseline, all of the fundamental infrastructure for a community to grow and become more complex, which is we all sort of agree that that's what's necessary. It's not just growth. You don't want to be a banana republic for a reason. One product is not good enough. You want to have a complex economy where everybody has different things to do. So that's something that we naturally want to do anyway. And then we sort of had to wait for countries to get their strategies together. We waited for Oman, and to be fair, Oman did it faster than anybody, actually. I think they have the most complete country strategy right now with how to deal with giving out tenders and finding out who gets the land and all of that. It has a process to it. But having started before that and having to wait for it is really frustrating as an investor and a developer. And really the timelines can be shortened by having guidelines like this. Because so I wouldn't look at it as like red tapeism, or that's sort of an Indian context, but it not so much as things you can't do, but all the things you can do. I mean, these show you all the ways, all the synergies, how to maximize the project so that, it is a win-win situation. And so I think it's fantastic. A lot of the things are things we talk about when we try to get investors in. And so I think it's quite important. And then the other one that I think is very important is why would you ever want to, recreate the exact same thing? Like a first of a kind project, everyone knows is really risky, right? So if you find a way for a project to be replicable, so you're really just copying it from one place to another, and you have this set of guidelines that shows, look, this is this type of project, and we can do all of these different things. That makes the investors much happier. That makes the banks happier. That's taking risk away, and it's adding value. It's adding value locally, and it's adding value to the project. So, I mean, I think these are really useful for all of those reasons. So that's it. I'm not disagreeing with any of the guidelines.
Thanks. Thank you, Smita. I think the challenge of coming in to speak after such a panel is that what can you add, really, right? But I think from the United Nations Environment Programme perspective, what I could perhaps add is a bit more on the environmental side of the benefits of such guidelines. And I think the key thing here is that when countries have such guidelines and they're starting to work with investors, by applying these guidelines, they can see or understand that they're taking steps towards implementing the multilateral environmental agreements we have and not taking steps to move further away from that implementation. So I mean that by having these guidelines, they can start to understand what does it mean to have an agreement with investors which will help me implement the Paris Agreement and my NDC and not actually take steps to move further away from that. But also I think how can these guidelines help me understand how I can implement the global biodiversity framework and ensure that this investment won't lead to harm to nature, and in fact will help me to ensure that investments at least nature neutral and perhaps nature positive. So I think that's key for us as an environment program to understand how these guidelines can help countries think about, remember that in fact a lot of the investment in green hydrogen is about promoting sustainable development in ways which won't lead to taking steps further away from implementation of these environmental agreements. I think something else, and something we hear in in the negotiations here in the UNFCCC is about how can we promote climate technology development and transfer. So I think these guidelines as well give us steps to understand how we can facilitate transfer in a way where the recipient country is building national capacity around this technology and not just a recipient for exportation. I think one final or additional aspect is building on what others have said, is that such guidelines are very much supporting trust, building trust between investors and the government. We heard that from other panelists, that it can be a common basis for negotiation. And again, understanding that if I engage in this with an investor, that I'm on the right track for my environmental concerns and for economic development. Thank you.
Thank you. Very good points, all of you. Just shows why it was a natural coalition among us to do this work. Now, some organization-specific questions which relate to also the topic that this organization is developing in the guidelines. So I'll start with UNCTAD. So Clovis, we hear a lot about local content requirement, and there's a lot of countries wanting to go for it, but at the same time being a bit worried about whether they'll be breaking any WTO rules. How can countries benefit from local content requirements without breaking WTO rules? Is that possible, and how?
Yes, so since these are guidelines, so we have to really guide how to move ahead with the set of rules that we have today, right? So having that in mind, there is a lot of important opportunities for diversification, value addition throughout the value chain, right? So upstream, and upstream is a very important element of for diversification. So not only the equipment, but infrastructure, construction, you know, anything that provides to the project. But of course, when we think about green hydrogen, we also think about the derivatives, and then further on. And I would like really us to consider the whole ecosystem of industries that could be interlinked to it, not stop in the derivatives of ammonia and others, but really move one step further. Otherwise, we'll continue talking about a commodity, right? So there are the possibilities to have content requirement as requested by or institutionalized or as a requirement of the government when it things related to services, for example. So for services, you can have elements of, you can have content requirement for them. As a guideline, we can also give there's a guideline for all stakeholders. It's not only government. So if a company decides to purchase and get goods and services from the local domestic sector, there is no rules that are breaking there. You know, if the company itself would like to follow that voluntarily, you know. So if this is to be a guideline to be applied, that can be also taken into consideration. So it's important for companies to understand that sourcing from the local domestic sector is important. Of course, as mentioned, many of these projects are far away from, so you have to have the understanding that has to be not only in the immediate place, but also closer city, big urban place, and so on. So those are some of the elements. And so what countries and other stakeholders have to have in mind is that they should set up some realistic targets at the beginning. understanding that should be flexible to also understand how to set these boundaries. It's perhaps go back and forward. So there should be that part of flexibility. It's important to have the infrastructure required. So part of it is not only to have local content requirement, but also have these agreements with the companies and the foreign investors to develop the midstream infrastructure required as well. That would facilitate. Promote technology transfer, skills development. So we are talking about the development because it's very clear, it'd be very easy to say, okay, we as a company, we would like to source locally, but there is no local capacity. No, it should be part of the package to build the capacity. Okay, it shouldn't be an impediment. Actually, it should be another step of it. And as in a government, it's really to have this monitoring, evaluate the success, and see how to set this balance. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of local content requirement, we mentioned, I heard, so sharing infrastructure, skills, and what else can be locally acquired?
Yeah, that's the thing. You know, there are things that can be, depending on each situation, there are things that can be acquired. I think what I mean really would like to put in the guideline is to make sure that it's not only what can be acquired now. This should be a strategy for diversification, understanding that the process of local content is the goal is to source locally. Maybe you don't have the locally yet, but it should be part of the package to build that capacity. So supply development should part of it. So it should be part of that strategy. Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you. We moved to a topic that Clovis mentioned already. So to UNEC, Dario, how can hydrogen projects in developing countries meet their requirements for a skilled labor force while also offering local employment opportunities? Do we have enough already, and what needs to be done? How can all stakeholders engage in this work?
Yes, thank you. Certainly building a hydrogen ecosystem is an employment opportunity, as Clovis said, is a development opportunity for many countries, particularly emerging countries, I would say. And therefore is as well as an employment opportunity, creation opportunity. It's interesting because in a previous panel there was the special envoy of Indonesia who said that one of the issues, one of the problems that have plagued the just transition economic programs, which is the JTPs, which is the programs that were thought about 2-3 years ago, how to wean off countries from coal mining into renewable energy, or into less carbon intensive forms of energy. And so a number of countries signed up, Indonesia, Vietnam, etc., and South Africa, exactly. And she pointed out, and I found that interesting, among the many challenges that the program had, which we'll not be talking about that here, but she mentioned the lack of skilled workforce for assessing that. And I think that is an aspect that needs to be part, and that's the reason why we put it in the guidelines, is because preparing the local workforce with the right skills is fundamental. And this is possible. I mean, the oil and gas industry does that on a regular basis. I mean, they operate in difficult environments, in faraway places. Oil is not in the middle of Baku. It's offshore, it's in the desert, it's in many hard to reach locations. And certainly you might start with, you know, some sort of foreign skilled workforce when you start the project, for the project build up, etc. Engineering companies, that kind of stuff. But over time, I mean, as you are looking at developing an ecosystem, you want to have local workforce, because they will be there, and then it's part of the social acceptance of those projects. You need to involve the local community. Involving local community, you mean sourcing from locally, as Clavin mentioned, but as well giving opportunities to the local community. So training of the local workforce needs to be part of any project that any investor is looking at, because it brings economic benefits. It brings the social license to operate, but it brings over time as well the economic benefits of having local population working, local employees working there, as opposed to having, not having that opportunity. So certainly that is a crucial aspect, I would say, of making those projects real and become real, actually, those projects.
Thank you. Alicia, the projects from Intercontinental Energy were very inspirational for us in UNIDO when we started developing the global program for hydrogen in industry. And I just wanted to touch on how did you do it? So do you have some examples to share with the community here?
Sure. Does this work now? Okay, good. Essentially, we looked at it holistically. So we did, very typical project management to actually plan out how you would structure it, and then look for every way that we can maximize ways to work with the community. So our second project in Australia, we actually partnered with the traditional owners of the land. And so they own 10% of the project, and we carry them to FID. They have a permanent board seat, and we have a charter so that we can't do anything to their land that they don't agree to, which is really not that hard. I mean, a lot of mining companies have gotten in trouble for blowing up caves and special sites. Really not difficult to avoid these things. So, people really aren't trying at all if they're messing up on these. But what I find to be interesting and some kind of poetic justice is that hydrogen seems to be almost everywhere in the world located on First Nations, traditional owners, nomadic lands. And it's because they were pushed off valuable lands, or lands that you could grow crops on, pushed into the desert, and given what at the time was considered the worst place to be. And that is the best place to make hydrogen. So from my point of view, I really appreciate that. It's a little bit of poetic justice. And I think that, you really have to work with them to see what it is that they want. So, I don't think that the guidelines should be so rigid as to say what type of schooling or jobs or whatever it is that we think makes sense. You still have to find out what that community actually wants. We don't want to have some kind of green imperialism. This is not the point. And we've actually run into problems where we thought of all these great ideas, and they were like, no, we don't want that. We don't want it. It's okay, we won't do it. It seems valuable, but don't find the thing that they actually want. So in Oman, what we did is instead of going with international engineering firm or an international firm to do the socioeconomic impact assessment, we chose a local firm that was amazing and a really, really quite good firm. And they were able to have these conversations with us and the community to see what people really wanted. So we're in Austa in Oman, which is almost nothing is there. There's a camel racing track, and there's some areas where nomadic people come through on a sort of regular every other year kind of basis, and they really don't leave anything behind. It's actually, we could learn something from their environmental skills, but they go through and you just can't, they still need to have that land for their camels or for whatever they're doing. And in that area, it's not really Bedouin. It's like its own tribe that covers that one area. They don't move around the whole country the way, like in Saudi, they might move around the whole country, but in Oman, they sort of stick to their state and then they move around that state. And so we talked to them about what it is that they wanted or what they feared about a project like this. And it was just things we wouldn't have ever thought of. I mean, the good and the bad. We wouldn't have thought of it if we hadn't gone with a local and spoken directly and really walked them through, like, this is what we're planning, and getting the, oh my God, there's a camel track there. You know, we didn't know that there was a camel track there. It doesn't show up when you do a lot of the surveying, and we've literally walked probably every inch of this land. But, you know, I think really working with people as opposed to making it a fight. There are ways, I mean, I feel like a lot of people have become very zero-sum in this world. And I still believe that you really can make it better for everyone. You can maximize outcomes for all parties. And I still think that we need to have a stakeholder capitalism where we are actually thinking about every party. And I think that that is actually, at the end of the day, even better for the shareholder in the long term. Now, it might not be better for quarterly earnings, but in the long term, those people that think about all the different stakeholders are not going to be running into permitting problems for no reason. They're not going to have a lot of the issues that companies that aren't thinking about the neighbors. And I was a little disappointed this year at the Climate Week in New York. A woman who heads a really big renewables company in the United States basically said that if the local community, and in this case it was a native population of American Indian population, if they didn't acquiesce to their terms in like a week, or if they didn't agree or they weren't on board and they don't want them there, she doesn't bother to negotiate. She just moves on to do it somewhere else. And I just thought, like, what a waste. I mean, you can't just, I find it so incredible that you wouldn't just try to see if there's a way for, I mean, it's like the old business school case. I don't know if you guys remember this, or you went to business school, maybe law school, a negotiation case. And you've got these two parties and they've got a big basket of oranges, and you have to figure out who can buy the oranges for the least amount of money, or who can do the best. And almost everyone fails this exercise because they just are like, there's a bag of oranges, there's two people, we only have so much money, and nobody can really win. But the people who start to empathize with the other party and they say, okay, what do you want the oranges for? They find out somebody wants the juice and somebody wants the peel. And then you have this amazing situation where everybody gets everything. And I think that it's still possible to do that. I mean, and we've been able to do that. We have still run into problems with communities that sometimes they are represented by another entity that has conflicted motives. And then you still run into these political situations. But still, I think that if you continue to make the correct decisions and you have a reputation for that, and you protect that reputation, because it's not a one game situation. This is a forever. You're with these people forever, you know. And so when they trust you, it makes things easier. And so yes, in the beginning you might have some issues, but if you see it through every time and you're acting the right way every time, then you do get everyone's commitment at the end of the day. And I truly believe that has worked for us, even through, there were rough times. And it was hard for us to have invested so much into Oman and then have Oman say, basically, you know, we're starting right now from fresh. We're going to redesign the whole program, and all of that data that you did for the entire country, well, we want it, and you can have like this other piece. I mean, that was very frustrating, but they did grandfather us. And of course, we ended up still having the same plan, and it worked at the end of the day. And they also have guidelines, which I think is going to make it easier for others. But for the first mover, it was a little bit frustrating. And I think that the point of these guidelines that I really like is that you're taking that first mover pain away from the investor side and the developer side, and also from the government side. I mean, I don't think Oman wants to do that again. I don't think they want to do that whole process of creating hydrum again. But other countries can follow that and probably not copy everything. But you want to make each decision or each mistake once, not 50 times. Let's learn from what other people have done before, and replicate in a way where we're constantly improving it, and we're constantly having a model. improve.
Thank you, Alicia. We heard about reticence of the local population from hydrogen in general. Maybe let's turn to UNEP and look at, there's a lot of worry about the hydrogen leaks, the environmental issues that's associated with that, which of course, well-founded, and also the whole acceptance of hydrogen projects in your backyard. How do you, which of those environmental factors do you think should be considered in hydrogen projects, and how can we do the best to avoid major environmental issues afterwards?
Thank you, Smita. I think on the one hand, we have the possibility to transition from a very established industry around ammonia production and hydrogen production in general. So there's a lot that applies, we can apply and learn from that. But I think when we're talking about green hydrogen, we can look at two sets of environmental issues. We can look at local issues, local contaminants, and we can look at what I could say more global issues on the environment as well. And I think one way of looking at this is in a life cycle analysis of green hydrogen. So that's talking about looking at from the very beginning of any extraction of materials to the construction, to the production and the transportation and any end of life there as well. When we look at extraction, we have to think about critical minerals and where we're extracting those from. So you've got social issues there, and you can have potentially environmental issues around mining, as we've heard from others as well. So that's something that we have to think about if we're taking a life cycle analysis on hydrogen production and transportation. As we move into production, we've heard issues around water usage. There's so much water that has to be used. That might have some issues in biodiversity as well, for the biodiversity we have in water. So that's something you have to take into consideration there. And then also on air, because there are leakages into production. This is normal in ammonia and hydrogen production in general. Hydrogen is odorless. It is transparent or clear gas. We can't see it or smell it. So in itself, it's not necessarily a contaminant, but highly flammable. So that can lead to issues, of course, for safety and potential significant costs and damages, both for industry, private sector, and for communities around there as well. And then I think looking at the global environmental issues, we have, for instance, the issue of transportation of green hydrogen. How do we transport hydrogen in a way which is low emissions? Because otherwise we're kind of using emissions to transport a low emission fuel. So we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot there. So is it perhaps more effective to use green hydrogen to make the production, to use the green hydrogen as a fuel for production of green steel or others, and then transport that, rather than the green hydrogen itself? So I think there's a couple of issues there on the environmental side, and I think on the acceptance side, which you mentioned as well, and we heard a lot about that from other panelists. But I think one thing, to build on what Dario was saying about the lack of a skilled workforce, we also have to take into consideration the lack of knowledge within governments. This is a very new technology for a lot of us, and therefore what kind of capacity building and education do we have to do with policymakers and regulatory authorities to ensure that they're providing the right framework for environment for these projects to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Opening the floor then to the government, Rebecca, can I ask you what ESG factor, environmental and social governance factors, have been of big importance for South Africa that you really had to address, and can the guidelines help at all?
No, thank you for that question. I think, South Africa If you talk about the green transition, we've had the first one with the power sector. So between 2014 and 2024, I think there's been a 300% increase in the deployment of renewables in the power sector. Granted, our coal sector is still, our coal, the percentage of coal-fired power is 77%, so down from 90, but we're at least moving in the right direction. So while we've made some strides, I think one of the huge challenges was that we haven't realized the social economic benefits as expected. So I think civil society feels a bit aggrieved around that. And then green, and the first thing whenever we talk about this, green hydrogen economy, is, what's in it for me, especially youth who are unemployed and so forth. So for me, I think one of the first things which I think is critical is the issue around prosperity, the issue around how do you structure your discussions with the civil society and the community. And I think in part, it's like, if you look at the guideline document, it talks best practice, international best practice. And I think that's really critical because, you can get local consultants who know the sector, who know people, but if they don't understand the framework of international best practice, you may not do the best thing possible. So I think that's the one thing that I think is critical around the social component. Then I think second to that, really around environmental protection. So I must say, you always think that you know a lot, and I know a lot about the hydrogen economy, but really in looking at the environmental protection chapter, which I spent quite a bit of time on, I really started to understand the interlinkages between climate change mitigation and biodiversity loss, right? So we can all agree that the deployment of renewable power will reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. However, when it comes to the local biodiversity loss, it could happen if you're not thoughtful about how you deploy. So, do you use existing land that was, for coal-fired power, and then, go from coal fields to, green fields? That's something we started to look and explore. Granted, you may not have the best sunshine there, but you're not going to have land use changes, which has an impact on national carbon sinks, which is something that is a natural resource that we often don't care about until we erode it. Or in South Africa, which is one of the most biodiverse countries in the world, this conversation is not happening effectively within the energy sector. It's happening within the sector of biodiversity, but not within the energy sector in any comprehensive way. And I think this really allowed that conversation again to be unpacked in a way that it makes sense to those who are in the renewable power sector, where it wasn't happening before. But also, I think in South Africa, like I say, we're looking at almost 900 billion rands worth of projects in the renewable hydrogen space. And South Africa will be putting in place a one-stop shop. So the question is, who do you invite to the meeting? So for me, I can use the guideline document to invite or not invite other government departments or agencies. That should be part of the process. And I think that's a powerful, it's written down, it's written by someone else. So you don't really necessarily are being funny when you're inviting or not inviting others. But I think this thing of getting a project across the finish line, if you have everyone required at the table, you hopefully will reduce the timeframes for getting a project across the table. And then I think last but not least, some of the, when you're making, they always say, under promise, over deliver. And I think what Clovis is saying around the WTO and the intentions of local content, what does that really mean? And again, putting in place reasonable targets around that. I think those conversations need to happen in an environment which is not emotionally charged, but while people are thinking clearly about this before we start a project. And I think speaking about localization of the services, if you are going to localize services, you need to start in advance, probably 3 to 4 years, to produce the skills and talent you need to then be able to meet those the services. And then also, how do you, I think I'm a big support of gender equality and social inclusion. You need to prepare people to be able to be in that service, and you can't do that unless you have a plan of action. So I think for me, and last but not least, I think just seeing the examples, just sitting next to a green hydrogen stalwart here, is just so exciting to see a woman, owning the sector in Oman and so forth. But also, I think the the guideline document actually had examples of projects. And I think for me, it was not saying that we're expecting environmental protection. We're saying Egypt has a project on migratory birds, soaring birds. This is what's happening in Namibia. This is what's happening in other emerging and developing economies. And when you see it happening that way, it makes you believe that you also can do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you to all the panelists. Maybe let's open the floor if anyone has questions for our panel members. Yep.
Thank you for the interesting panel. My name is Joel Bringwood, and I have three questions. Investors seem to be scared to invest in more unstable states with a higher risk but favorable conditions. What is the solution for that? Maybe first of all, more peace-building missions to make peace and unlock renewable energy potential and create prosperity for the local community by that? And second, how to build the demand for green hydrogen and green H2 so that it comes to offtake agreements, because offtake agreements are difficult to contract and finding investors either. And the co-benefit produce salt from brine from the desalination plant in terms of biodiversity loss. To not inject the brine in high concentrations in the ocean is crucial. Thank you.
Sorry. So first question was about how do countries, how do we promote investment in uncertain countries, countries with uncertain political situations. Anyone wants to take it? Otherwise, I can chip in.
From the investment side, you would use, sovereign guarantees. There's all sorts of instruments that we've seen in typical project finance to alleviate that risk. But yeah, like it is a FOAC, it's a first of a kind project, and it has its own set of risks. But then if it's also in a politically unstable or any number of different risks that are on a country level, then you would have to use the traditional types of insurance. And I think that's why ECAs are so important and will be going into the future. I think that there's just a lot of asset building for this transition, and we are not used to it. And especially in the Western world, a lot of the big infrastructure was built a long time ago. And really, the global South is actually more comfortable with project finance than Europe, because they're actually doing it. So he is something to add.
Dario?
It's actually in a previous life I was the chief underwriting officer of an export credit agency. So, and my role was to support, the export credit agency's role is to support exports from their national countries. So Exim Bank in the US, SACE in Italy, etc. But and cover the risk with the market is not able to cover. So political risks, economic risks, with all the different, under political, there are many types of risk, unavailability, contract frustration, guarantees frustration, lack of, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's and what we work with DFIs because they were bringing as well the long tenors necessary for many of these infrastructure projects, because one of the issues is as well, financial, the private capital markets might not have the right tenors for the loans, the lending that you look at. You might be able to lower the interest rate with mitigants, with insurance, as Anujay said, and coverage from export credit agencies, blended finance structures with DFIs participating into it, and then certainly you have a lot more innovative markets. For example, so one day we will have a carbon market, because the carbon markets will have to be finally developed in a proper way, because they are critical to the energy transition, and those carbon markets will provide that revenue gap which might be missing in the project to make it sustainable. So there are plenty of tools to address those risks, whether are commercial risk, political risk, environmental risk, social risk, whatever it is the case. The difficult part is to put that together. to structure the project, to do what she did in Oman. That is the difficult part, but because the solutions are out there, plenty of them.
Indeed, we see a lot more of insurers coming into the picture nowadays for hydrogen. Actually, a lot more this year that I've noticed in the previous years. Their role, I think, is starting to become more tangible. There's lots of call for them. And I would say, I think also that's the role that having the UN as part of the project development helps, because we have a role of working in between the government and the private sector to create that political framework for such investment to happen. And we can, to some extent, try to lower such risks. Yes? Oh, sorry. Yes, there's a second question. Yeah, okay, Darren.
Well, yeah, Smith, I don't think I'm spoiling anything, but your question on the demand for hydrogen is very critical. And that's the reason why COP29 presidency and all of these organizations that are sitting here, plus a bunch of others, have worked with the COP29 presidency to launch tomorrow the declaration on hydrogen, which is addressing the issue around the lack of demand for hydrogen, and that is exactly right. Hydrogen, as I said, is a chemical feedstock. It can be used as well, the energy transition, and a different sort of things. But to create the conditions for that, you need a commitment. You need, somebody who jumps the first and makes those long-term commitments that you mentioned as well. And so tomorrow we're launching this declaration, which it's not a pledge, but it's a declaration, but it's a kind of rallying cry to all the stakeholders to address the issue around demand and create the conditions to facilitate then the projects that are waiting for that demand to take place.
Actually, I would just say, I don't really agree with the narrative that there is not enough demand. There is plenty of demand. There's actually too much demand for what we can produce in the time frame that is needed. What they don't have is the same subsidies that oil and gas gets right now. So you have an uneven playing field where you have $11 trillion a year being spent on fossil fuels, and then you have a new green substitute that is supposed to compete with an incumbent. Even if they were identical in terms of their footprint, it would be difficult. But you're getting $11 trillion of subsidy in the fossil fuel side. And then we ask for 10 billion, and it's like, can't you stand on your own? Why do you need to be subsidized? If it makes sense, you shouldn't need subsidies. Well, they've been subsidizing fossil fuels for 100 years. And it'd be nice if they stood on their own. And then maybe we would be able to compete a little bit easier.
Thank you. I just want to thank our panel for taking the time at such a late time in the day. I'm Caroline Gittel from the Green Hydrogen Organization, and I'm going to try and make sense at such an hour. So this morning we had a gentleman from the African Development Bank who was talking in a general financing renewable energy way about the fact that we need to stop thinking about talking about MDBs, DFIs for investment. We need to look at local capital markets for investments in renewable energy. Is that possible for hydrogen? I mean, you just touched on it. When is it going to be possible? Are local markets, are local investors knowledgeable enough about hydrogen and ready to take on that risk? And do they have enough funds for hydrogen? Thank you.
And you?
Yeah, I think there are just many different situations in different countries. So if you look at countries that might have iron ore, they also could have the circumstances to produce hydrogen, then they could be doing iron ore beneficiation and then exporting out a higher chain commodity that is actually smaller, requires less fuel to ship it wherever it's being shipped to. But essentially they're doing what they did before and they're just decarbonizing that process. And I think that's available to do in a number of regions around the world. So I do think that there is local demand. Like we see around our projects, there will be a need, if not initially, it becomes increasingly more domestic in demand because you actually create a circular economy around your project. You're recycling your steel, so you have a steel provider who you provide a hydrogen to make the steel, and then you're recycling through them as well. And that type of thing is something that we're trying to basically replicate around the world. And again, that's why the guidelines are so nice, is that it is a footprint, or it is a map to do things more easily and quickly.
From the South African context, I would say that early on in the renewable sector, it was DFIs that were making investments. So DBSA, Development Bank of South Africa, and Industrial Development Corporation, which is, I think, is 80 years old. DBSA is a little bit younger. And then only once the cost came down did your local guys like Nedbank, APSA start making investments or supporting that. In the hydrogen space, I'm proud to say DBSA has made an investment in hydrogen. They're one of the investors in the Hyphen project in Namibia. So they do invest outside the South African borders. And I can imagine if they're going to invest in Hyphen, they would definitely invest in a project in South Africa. But again, we're trying to do the feeds, the studies to get to FID. But once we get to that level, then we'll have, IDC and DBSA making investments. And then also, we have quite a few bilateral agreements, the one we signed with Netherlands last year on the sidelines of the World Hydrogen Summit, I think 2023, 1 billion, I think, euros. And then Germany, there's a KfW, there's been agreements and so forth. So there is money, but the question is making sure the projects that you put this money towards will give the outcome that we expect. So promises have been made. The question is which project will be the first mover in South Africa is probably where we're relying.
Yeah, two more comments.
I just wanted to say one thing about whoever was speaking, that the multilaterals don't need to be involved, and we can finance it locally. I would just point out that every single development bank, no matter what their purview is, whatever countries they follow, whether it's Asia or it's Latin America or it's Eastern Europe, whatever, every single one in every single country they're invested in, they have cement, they have concrete, they have bridges, they have beer, they have exact same investments in their portfolios, and all of those investments need to be decarbonized. So they could be the people to create their own offtake, because they're the ones with the standards. When you have IFC in, they hold you to an ESG standard that should be the highest level. So if they sell out because they're not at the highest level of ESG, that's the worst thing you could do, because then the company is going to be completely abandoned. So these banks have a problem in their hands right now that needs to be solved, and no one's really forcing them to do it. But it's pretty obvious that it needs to be done, and they have to do it themselves anyway. So it would be a really good first start if they actually did what they say they do, which is to provide capital when the market won't, and not compete with other people providing capital. It's a little saltier than I expected, but.
No, I think to add from the United Nations Environment Program side, we work with more than 100 countries on different environmental mitigation projects on areas like energy efficiency, electric mobility. And for many developing countries, we see that the MDBs, IFIs, DFIs play a very important role, primarily because the local financiers, local capital, don't have the understanding yet. It's quite uncertain, quite scared. So therefore, working with an MDB, as we heard, is very important. So I think in Australia, probably not, but many countries around the world are not at that stage and would require that support. I think in our view, we're seeing that in other technologies which are actually more advanced than green hydrogen. Thanks.
Thank you. I think, given the time of the day, I think we should wrap it up. So we've had an excellent panel, two very interesting presentations. What I take away from the guidelines is that it will help to build trust by setting clear goalposts, and it provide guidelines to transfer clean technologies. It's a new technology that countries are not used to, and giving some guidelines for countries to follow is welcome. So I'd like to thank you all very much. Thank you to my excellent panel, and it's been a pleasure working with you for writing those guidelines, and we look forward to hopefully publishing it in the next couple of months. Thank you. Can we have a picture? Jan.